Okay, are we all right? We're good? Okay, amen. Thank you, Chancellor Choir, and Victoria and Christine, and good morning again. My name is Andy, and I have the privilege of being the teaching pastor here at Walnut Hill Church, and the pastor of Thrive, and associate pastor at Lovers Lane. And I'm so excited to be with you this morning. We are continuing a sermon series on the Lord's Prayer. And I'm just really excited about this series. Prayer is one of the only things that the disciples asked Jesus to teach them. When we read throughout the Gospels, the disciples, one of the only things that they ask Jesus to teach them is to teach the Lord's Prayer. Now, Jesus taught them many different things, right? Jesus taught them all about these things, but one of the only things explicitly the disciples asked Jesus to teach them was the Lord's Prayer. And the reason was because that the disciples caught Jesus praying. So I want to ask you again, last week we asked this question, I want to ask you again, when was the last time you were caught praying? When was the last time you were caught praying? I shared last week that I've tried to make it a practice of inviting my children into my prayer practice of when I'm praying, if they want to join me, the answer is always no. And if there's anything I can pray about, but I want to ask, when was the last time you were caught praying? Last week we began this series by covering quite a bit of the Lord's Prayer. We unpacked Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name, and thy kingdom come, thy will be done. That's what we talked about last week. This week we learn about the phrase that Jesus teaches his disciples, asking for, give us this day our daily bread. This is a phrase that Jesus taught his disciples. And I wonder if this phrase isn't impactful for us as well. I want to ask you a question. If you were to go back 20 years ago and talk to yourself 20 years ago and tell your 20 years ago self the things you would have now, how would they respond? How would you respond? Right? If you were to go back to yourself 20 years ago and tell yourself the technology that you would have today, how would you respond, right? If you would tell them, not only do we have these incredibly advanced computers, but we also have computers in our pockets that can tell us just about any information that we need to know. It can do just about anything we want it to do. Your 20 years ago self might have said, oh my gosh, imagine all the free time that you must have now, right? If you would have told yourself 20 years ago the way you would be living now, maybe the amount of money that you'd be making, the house that you would live in, the lifestyle that you would have, imagine yourself talking to yourself 20 years ago might say, oh my gosh, you must have it all. You must be so content with yourself and satisfied with life. But the likelihood is that we are not quite satisfied. There's this thing that social psychologists call hedonic adaptation. Hedonic coming from the word hedonism, and adaptation, or even some call it the hedonic treadmill. This idea that we almost immediately adapt to our circumstances and desire just a bit more in order to be satisfied. This hedonic adaptation, this hedonic treadmill, this idea that we have adapted to our current circumstances and require just a little bit more in order to be satisfied. Social psychologists have discovered that 6 months after moving into a new house, we are just as happy as before we moved, right? So immediately when we moved into the new house, we had experienced this kind of peak happiness, and then 6 months later, we have become just as happy as before we moved. They have also discovered that 6 months after winning the lottery, right, more money than they could ever imagine, those lottery winners 6 months later are less happy than before they won the lottery. Why? Because they've adapted. They have required just a little bit more. They've also discovered that we are happiest when our boss or our supervisor has told us we will receive a raise. We are happiest when we have been told that we are receiving a raise, not when we see that money hit our bank account. Why? Because when we are told that we are getting the raise, we have achieved this kind of peak happiness. And then in the time between when we are told we get the raise and when we actually see the money, we have adapted. and required just a little bit more. This idea of more will continue. What I've learned is this, maybe you know this as well, that more will always create a desire for more. More will always create a desire for more, but enough will always create a desire for enough. More will always create a desire for more, but enough will always create a desire for enough. If we require more, think, well, if I just do this, if I live here, if I get this, and sometimes we can ascribe that more to somebody else. If they will do this, right? If my children will live this way, if they will make these choices, then I will be satisfied. Or if I can get and live in this house, if I can make this much, if I can just get that thing, then I will be satisfied. And the answer is no, we won't. Why? Because more will always create a desire for more. But enough will always create a desire for enough. And I believe that secret to enough is found in the Lord's Prayer, is found in this phrase, give us this day our daily bread. Now again, Jesus was caught praying. If you find it in the Gospel of Luke chapter 11 or Matthew chapter 6, you find that Jesus was caught praying by his disciples. And as soon as he's done praying, his disciples say, Lord, teach us to pray. Luke adds, as John taught his disciples, and John the Baptist. And so Jesus teaches them and us this prayer. The prayer that we find in the Gospel of Luke is a little different than what we find in the Gospel of Matthew. Matthew is most closely related to what we say on Sunday morning. The modern church has adapted it a bit and added what we call the doxology, for thine is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever. We have added that part, and we'll talk about that more at the end of our series, actually on Ash Wednesday. But this phrase, give us this day our daily bread, when Jesus said that phrase, when he tells his disciples, give us this day our daily bread, I imagine that tapped into something that the disciples already knew about. And I believe that phrase, daily bread, might have hearkened back to a story that they all knew. That story is in the book of Exodus, chapter 16. We're going to read out of this passage this morning, and if you have a Bible with you, or if you use your phone, or however you engage with the Bible this morning, I encourage you to do that. We're going to be in Exodus 16. That's a chapter we're going to be in, and we're going to bounce around a little bit from there, but we're going to begin in verse 2. So just a little bit of backstory. The story of Exodus is a story in which God liberates the Hebrew people out of slavery in Egypt. God's people, the Hebrews, are in slavery in Egypt, and they cry out to God that God would free them. And God sends Moses and Aaron to free these Hebrew people. They are liberated out of Egypt, and they are taken to the Promised Land. And when they get to the Promised Land, they realize there are people living there, and they kind of waffle, right? They say, should we go into this land? And they say, no, it's already full, and we really don't need to take it. And so because of that, God says, okay, you're going to wander now for 40 years. This generation that has waffled, that has decided not to do what I told you to do, they're going to die off, and then I'm going to send the next generation into the Promised Land. And so the people begin to wander along with Moses through the desert, through this wilderness. And this is a story that we come to in that wilderness time. Again, Exodus 16, verse 2, we read this. The whole congregations of the Israelites complained against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness. The Israelites said to them, if only we had died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the flesh pots and ate our fill of bread. For you have brought us out into the wilderness to kill this whole assembly with hunger. Talk about ungrateful, right? I mean, they had been in slavery in Egypt. They had cried that God would liberate them, would deliver them from the hand of slavery. And here they are, freed from that hand. And now people are complaining, if only we had died back in Egypt. If only we had died back in Egypt, for now we are hungry. Those of you who know me know that my family and I are originally from Oklahoma. And so every once in a while, my family of 5 and I, my wife, Melissa, and our 3 children, we take a drive up to Oklahoma. And depending on where we go, Whether it's Oklahoma City or the Tulsa area, it takes between 3 and 4 hours, 4-ish hours to get to our destination. Those of you who traveled with young children know that drive typically requires at least one stop. And, we'll be driving up into Oklahoma, and every once in a while, somebody will say in the back, I've got to go to the bathroom, right? And so, that's not something we play around with, and so we just say, okay. And so we stop at the gas station, and then we turn around, and we have a very serious conversation. Maybe you've had this one as well. A very serious conversation that goes, this is the only time we are stopping. This is the only time we are stopping. If you need to go even a little bit, go now. And almost always, the rest of the crew will respond, we don't need to go. And so the one who needs to do their business gets out of the car, and parents walk in, and then the other one gets back in the car, and we drive away. And probably about 5 minutes later, we hear from the back of the car, if only we had gone to the bathroom back in the land of ExxonMobil, when we sat in the parking lot and had access to a clean bathroom, right? Like, now just imagine that times 1,000, right? This is Moses. Moses has liberated the people from the hand of slavery. They have seen miracles by the hand of God. They have walked through the Red Sea with the water on their left and their right. They have seen these incredible things, and here they are in the wilderness complaining. If only we had died back in the land of Egypt. And so, God responds. God responds at the beginning of verse 4. We read this in Exodus 16. The Lord said to Moses, I am going to rain bread from heaven for you, and each day the people shall go out and gather enough for that day. In that way I will test them, whether they will follow my instruction or not. On the 6th day, when they prepare what they bring in, it will be twice as much as they gather on other days. God says, fine, I am going to rain bread from heaven. I am going to rain bread from heaven, and when they go out and gather it, they will gather enough. They will gather enough. And then on the 6th day, they will gather twice as much as they require from normal days. Why? Because on the 7th day, they will practice Sabbath. Sabbath is a 24-hour day of rest where you rest from all the work that you do the other 6 days. God says, I'm going to do this. I'm going to provide them bread from heaven, and they will gather enough for those days. And God says this will be a test for them. How much will they gather? And so, this is how God does it. We're going to skip from Exodus to Exodus 16, verse 13. We read this. In the evening, quails came up and covered the camp. And in the morning, there was a layer of dew across the camp. And when the layer of dew lifted, there on the surface of the wilderness was a fine, flaky substance, as fine as the frost on the ground. When the Israelites saw it, they said to one another, what is it? For they did not know what it was. Moses said to them, it is bread the Lord has given you to eat. This is what the Lord has commanded you. Gather as much as each of you needs, an omer to a person according to the number of persons, all providing those in their own tents. The Israelites did so. Some gathered more, some less, but when they measured it with an omer, those who had gathered it had nothing over, and those who gathered little had no shortage. They gathered as much as each of them needed. God says, this is the test. I am going to give you enough for today. I'm going to give you daily bread. And the test is to see how much you will gather. How much, in other words, do you trust that I am the God of enough? Will you gather more than you need? Or will you gather enough? Because God says, I'm going to give you a little bit more tomorrow and a little bit more tomorrow. I'm going to give you enough for the day. How much will you take? I love this passage, especially whenever they respond, what is it? What is it in this passage in verse 15? And if you have a Bible on you, if you're using an app, there might be a footnote there. That phrase, what is it? What is it in Hebrew is literally manna, What is it? In other words, they said manna, and Moses said, yeah, that's what it's called, right? Like I don't know. It's this mysterious way in which God has provided enough for today. This mysterious way in which God has provided enough. Because God is the God of enough. So God tells them, gather enough for today, but some didn't obey those words. Again, in verse 19, we read this, and Moses said to them, let no one leave any of it over until morning. In other words, don't hoard the manna. Let no one leave it over until morning, but they did not listen to Moses. Some left part of it until morning and bred worms and became foul, and Moses was angry with them. Morning by morning, they gathered it as much as each needed. But when the sun grew hot, it melted. Some tried to hoard it, but it didn't work. God says, this will be the test for you. I had a mentor that told me that throughout Exodus, God is not trying to get the Hebrew people out of Egypt. Throughout Exodus, God is not trying to get the Hebrew people out of Egypt, but God is trying to get Egypt out of the Hebrew people. God said, back in Egypt, you were known by how many bricks you made. This was your value. This was your worth. I am trying to work that mentality out of you. Back in Egypt, you had this idea that if you just had this, you would be happy, and I'm trying to work that out of you through all of these means. One of them is through manna. Why? Because more will always create a desire for more. But enough will create a desire for enough. So my question for you is, what is enough? Now, I hope you don't hear what I'm not saying, right? This is not a sermon condemning you if you have so much in your bank account or if you have so little. This is not a sermon that condemns someone who lives in a house of a certain square footage, whether more or less. This is not a sermon about, condemning people who are wealthy or people who are poor. This is not that sermon. But this is a reminder of what Jesus says, that those to whom much is given, much is required. With that in mind, what is enough? The director of my Wesley program in college, Wesley programs are kind of United Methodist collegiate ministries, and my Wesley director there at Oklahoma City University, her name was Jennifer Long. We called her J-Lo, and Jennifer Long was an amazing pastor and just an awesome person, and she was trying to prepare us for ministry. And one day she was telling us about a conversation that she was having with somebody she was asking to help fund the ministry there at Oklahoma City University, and they asked for a certain amount, and this person who might have been the funder said, you know what, to be honest, I make so much that it's hard to give that amount. And Jennifer said that she immediately began praying in the middle of this conversation. And the person asked, said, what are you doing? She said, I'm asking God to lower the amount of money you make so that you might be freer to give it. This is a reminder of what Jesus says, that those to whom much is given, much is required. So the question for us is, what is enough? Because more will always create a desire for more, but enough will always create a desire for enough. Jesus asked us to pray that God would give us this day our daily bread. And I believe this mentality of daily bread is what creates happiness. Happiness is not derived from having more, but from having enough. That we, as people of the United States, are endowed with certain unalienable rights. That our founders believed that we had the right, regardless of who we were, to pursue life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness. That this is believed to be endowed to us by our Creator, that we have the right to pursue happiness. And I believe that the way we do that is not by craving more, but by looking at what we have and seeing it as enough. This desire for more, this idea for more is what Walter Brueggemann calls, the prominent theologian Walter Brueggemann calls the myth of scarcity. And the myth of scarcity is simply this: the myth that there won't be enough. This myth of scarcity is the idea, is this myth that there won't be enough. Maybe you've experienced this. Maybe when you've walked through the grocery store in the last 2 years and you've seen that there was a certain item that has been picked over, right? A certain item that you hadn't expected, that there, wouldn't be a shortage on bread, but you walked by and there's, a few loaves left and they're all kind of askew. That it wasn't necessarily on your list of things to buy that day, but you decided to grab it. Why? Because there's this myth that there won't be enough. Myth of scarcity exists in my household. My wife lovingly gave me a bag of my favorite candy for Valentine's Day, Reese's Pieces. I love Reese's Pieces, and she gave me a bag of Reese's Pieces, and every day I take a little bit from that bag, and then I store that bag on the top shelf of our pantry, just a little further back than necessary so that small eyes can't see it. Why? Because I'm afraid that I'm going to run out of Reese's Pieces. This myth of scarcity, this myth that there won't be enough, is this idea that constantly creates in us this mentality for more. And more will always create a desire for more, but enough will create a desire for enough. This idea of enough, Brueggemann calls the liturgy of abundance. The liturgy of abundance is this: it is our actions that reflect that God is the God of enough. The liturgy of abundance is our actions. Liturgy, from the Latin liturgia, literally means work of the people. So that when we respond, when we do a call and response, when we say the Lord's Prayer together, when we sing together, all of that is liturgy, because it is the work of the people, but it is more than that. It is everything we do as a people of faith. And when our actions, the liturgy of abundance, when our actions reflect that God is the God of enough, we are practicing this mentality of the liturgy of abundance. What have your actions reflected? What have your actions reflected? My hope and my prayer for us this morning is that we would have enough. That we would have enough. And there are two things that I hope we will do, that we will take away. You can call them action steps, you can call them takeaways, whatever. I hope that you will practice these things this week, regardless of what you believe. You may be here this morning and not know what you believe about Jesus. You may have followed Jesus your entire life. But I hope that you will just try this on and see if it doesn't make a difference in your life. The first thing that I hope you will do is that you will practice Sabbath. That you will practice Sabbath. Sabbath is literally a 24-hour day of rest. Sabbath is a 24-hour day of rest. Sabbath is not a little hour here and a little hour there, and all those add up to 10 hours, and at least I was close enough. Sabbath is a 24-hour day of rest, a day that you rest from all the work that you had done. I preached this at Thrive 9:30 this morning down to Inwood Road and Northwest Highway campus of Lover's Lane. And I had at least 3 questions about what counted as Sabbath, right? Well, can I do laundry on the Sabbath? Can I do yard work on the Sabbath? Can I do this? And my answer is, whatever is life-giving to you and not work is Sabbath. Right? There is a whole laundry list of things here in the Old Testament that you could strictly follow as rest. Not walking so far, not picking up so many sticks, not doing all these different things. If you want to follow it that legalistically, I would encourage you to try that. But what I will tell you is whatever is rest for you to do that for 24 hours for one day. And it's not just me that's telling you, I know you don't want to do it, but it's what God said. But this is literally, God told you to do it. It's not me telling you to do it. God, one of the 10 Commandments is to honor the Sabbath day and keep it holy. God was not telling you to go to church for an hour. That was not what God meant. God told you to rest for 24 hours. To rest for 24 hours and give life to yourself. God was not trying to get the Hebrew people out of Egypt. God was trying to get the Egypt out of the Hebrew people. God said, before you were known by how much work you can do, and now you will be known as a people who rest, because your worth is not in your work. Your worth is in whose you are, that you are a child of God. Friends, Walnut Hill Church, neighbors, loved ones, your worth is not in how much work you can do, but in whose you are. I might have told you, to rest for 24 hours, and the first thought that went through your head is, I can't do that. There are other people who can do that, people who are less important than me, people who are less busy than I am. One of the most prominent addictions in our society is our work addiction. In fact, we are praised for being addicted to work. Found an article in the New Yorker that gave signs for work addiction. Maybe these are familiar to you. These are things that you do if you might be addicted to work. You free up more time to work. You say, well, I'm going to go to the grocery store, and then you sit for an hour in the parking lot answering emails on your phone. You spend more time working than originally intended. You sat down in the study and said you were going to answer emails for 10 minutes, and 2 hours later you looked up and noticed the time had passed. You work to avoid feelings of anxiety, helplessness, or depression. That as soon as these negative emotions start to well up in you, you point your brain towards a work task or project so that you don't have to feel these feelings. Or your work affects your own health or your relationships. That your own health has been negatively affected, and your relationships have been negatively affected by your work. That others have told you need to slow down. You need to not work so much. And you've thought, that's not important to me. Regardless of your circumstance, I would encourage you to practice a 24-hour day of rest, so that you will know that your worth is not in your work, but in whose you are. So the first thing I hope you will do is that you will practice the Sabbath, a 24-hour day of rest. The second thing I hope you will do is this, that you will give away everything that does not bring you joy. Give away everything that does not bring you joy. Here's what I know, that off-site storage in the United States is a billion-dollar industry. Now, some of you may have off-site storage, some of you may not, and what I'm not saying is that off-site storage is inherently evil. What I am saying is many times we hold on to things not because they bring us joy, but because we are afraid that we might need it someday. That is not a reason to hold on to something. Fear is not a reason to hold on to something. That is the myth of scarcity. What I'm asking you to do is to look at what you have and consider the amount of joy it might be to hand that to someone else and to say, I'd like you to have this. I'd like you to have this. It'll bring me more joy for you to have this than for me to hold on to it and it get no use. Give away everything that does not bring you joy. Practice 24-hour day of rest, a Sabbath. Why? Because more will always create a desire for more. But enough will create a desire for enough. A couple weeks ago, I was at my home in the morning preparing to come into Dallas to do work, and And as I was preparing to leave, I was looking through my kitchen for what I was going to bring with me to eat lunch. And as I looked through and looked in the fridge and looked in the pantry, my wife Melissa caught me, and I found something in my pantry that I didn't really know existed. You know how that happens? Like there are things in our pantries that we look at and we're just like, where did this come from? And I found like a microwavable meal in my pantry. Actually, I found a stack of them. There were like 2 or 3 of them. And I found them, and I said, are these for anything? And Melissa shook her head no, and I said, okay, I'm going to take one. And so I started to walk out, and Melissa had the other one in her hand. She said, you better take 2, because those are kind of small. And so I did. So I took the other one, and I was coming down to the church, and actually the first thing that I was preparing to do was, the first thing I had to do that morning was to meet someone for coffee, and I pulled off of 75, and I was at a stoplight. And there I looked to my left, and there was a person there with a sign. Right, you've probably seen these people before, and you may think one thing about them or another. You may judge them or feel compassion upon them, and I want to let you know I run the gambit of those emotions as well. But as I saw this person on the side of the road, I remembered the words of Jesus. That if anyone asks for my coat, I should give it to them. That if anybody asks me to carry their pack for a mile, I should walk with them too. And I saw this person on the side of the street, and I looked down and I saw these 2 meals that I had. Not one, but I had 2. And so I took one and I gave it to this person. Now, this is not a story about how I saved somebody's life by giving them a meal. It's very likely that this person would have found another way to eat that day had I not given them that meal. But it is a story about how God continually teaches me about enough. Prayer that God would give us this day our daily bread is not a prayer that God would rain upon us wealth and prosperity, but a prayer that God would change our lenses for what we see around us as enough, and then when we have enough, that we would live generously. Because our generosity is an answer to somebody else's prayer for daily bread. Will you join me in an attitude of prayer? God, we thank you for enough. We pray that it would be so. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.